A Thanksgiving turned tragic. In the peaceful suburbs of a small Texan town, the season of gratitude, warmth, and togetherness suddenly turned into a nightmare. It was the eve of Thanksgiving when families came together to share meals, exchange laughter, and give thanks for all they held dear. For the residents of Cedar Glen, it was supposed to be just another picture-perfect holiday, the kind you'd find on postcards: autumn leaves blanketing yards, scent of turkey roasting in the air, and murmurs of football games on TV. Society had a quiet rhythm during this time of year where everything slowed down, letting folks soak in the joy of family reunions. For Cedar Glen, however, the festive mood would be replaced by unspeakable horror that no one would ever forget. It began quietly. A young man named Patrick Hensley, ordinary on the outside but harboring dark resentments within, would shatter the town's sense of safety forever. Patrick was not a stranger to the community. Neighbors knew him as the polite kid who sometimes mowed lawns for extra cash, a loner who avoided trouble, or so they thought. Behind his quiet demeanor, Patrick had spent months nursing a deadly grudge. This wasn't the sort of story typical of Thanksgiving cheer, but one of terror seeping into the holidays like a shadow at the edge of candlelight. No warning came, no sign of imminent disaster. Patrons at the local diner even recall seeing Patrick chew on a slice of pecan pie the very night before, seemingly calm, his eyes scanning the counter while fiddle music played softly in the background. Back then, none of the waitstaff could have guessed the chaos he would unleash the following evening. Murders on Thanksgiving? It was unthinkable, not when people around here still believed doors could be left unlocked overnight. But Cedar Glen, like any town, had its share of conflicts and tensions. Patrick had grown resentful towards the Dunhams, a family living just 2 streets away. What started as a forbidden romance with their daughter Maggie had evolved into shouting matches on front porches, slammed doors, and pointed accusations from both parties. Patrick wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. The rejection, the isolation festered inside him as he sought revenge in a way so drastic, so unimaginable, that it left 8 innocent people dead. The Dunham household wasn't just an address to Patrick, it was a fortress of people he felt were against him. And so, when the rustic autumn evening descended on November 23rd, little did anyone know it would be a turning point for this quiet town. Dogs barked aimlessly in backyards as dusk fell, their owners too busy basting turkeys to notice the unnatural anticipation in the air. Patrick, meanwhile, packed an AR-15 rifle he had procured through illegal means, rehearsing the steps of his plan with mechanical precision. What turned a small-town Thanksgiving, a time of love and community, into the setting for one of the deadliest events in its history was no longer a mystery by the time the police would find the blood-strewn remnants of the Dunham residence. With 8 lives lost and an entire town left reeling, Thanksgiving was no longer Cedar Glen's beloved holiday. It had become the marking of horror, the weight of which resonated far beyond state lines. Years later, headlines would refer to it as the Cedar Glen Massacre. But in that moment, it was simply pure chaos. Murder in a season that should have promised peace. The killer and his calculated plan. Patrick Hensley wasn't someone many would refer to as a monster, at least not at first glance. A 22-year-old young man with sunken eyes, unruly auburn hair, and a quiet demeanor, he largely drifted through life unnoticed. But behind that almost mundane exterior lay something brewing, dark, calculated, and driven by what he perceived as betrayal. His actions hadn't fallen into place on a whim. They were meticulously planned over several months, with precision that could rival the operations in a military playbook. Patrick's grudge against the Dunham family didn't spring up overnight. The spark had been lit a year earlier when he began dating Maggie Dunham, the oldest child of the family. Maggie was the type of person who radiated warmth, a young woman with a bright future ahead of her. Together, they were an unlikely pair. She, outgoing and hopeful. He, introverted and burdened by a troubled past. It wasn't long before Maggie's parents, particularly her father, started interfering, deeming Patrick unsuitable for their daughter. Whispers about his lack of education, odd demeanor, and financial instability reverberated until Maggie finally broke things off under her parents' pressure. To Patrick, the breakup wasn't just a rejection from Maggie. It was a collective rejection from the Dunham family, a symbol of what he always believed, that society only respected those with wealth, power, and status. He became obsessed with the idea of vengeance. And instead of moving on, he began building a plan so intricate, it appeared almost methodical, chillingly devoid of emotion. Patrick started small, visiting hunting forums and online marketplaces where weapons could be bought under the radar. He procured an AR-15 rifle through a shady online transaction, one of the countless unlicensed exchanges that made weapons accessible to almost anyone. This wasn't a maniac wielding a random tool. Patrick studied each component, learned the mechanics of the firearm, and practiced his aim in the secluded woods on the outskirts of Cedar Glen. Neighbors occasionally heard gunshots in the distance but chalked them up to local hunters. Patrick's isolation raised no red flags. It was characteristic of him. But what made Patrick's plan truly unnerving was its patience. This wasn't the work of someone acting out impulsively. His grievances festered day after day as he tracked the Dunham family's routines and movements. Where did they shop? When did they return home? Did they have security cameras or weapons of their own? He even took note of their holiday traditions, knowing that Thanksgiving would draw everyone together in one place, making it the perfect moment to strike. Patrick's greatest strength, ironically, lay in how unremarkable he appeared. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no blatant outward signs of hostility. People who interacted with him at the local gas station or grocery store described him as quiet, maybe a little off, but certainly not dangerous. He wove himself into the fabric of Cedar Glen, a shadow in plain sight, while steadily preparing for the bloodshed he was convinced would bring him justice. Things came to a head on the evening of November 22nd. Patrick parked his beaten-up sedan 2 blocks away from the Dunham residence, his movements so calculated that he even accounted for the town's Thanksgiving parade schedule to blend in with the holiday's peculiarities. Hours before the massacre, he sat in his car with the engine off, staring blankly at the street below, fine-tuning every step of his plan. In his mind, this wasn't murder, it was retribution. He saw himself as the victim of a system that had failed him, a man breaking free from years of perceived suppression by leveling the field in the most violent way imaginable. When he moved later that night, carrying the AR-15 wrapped in an old blanket, no one stopped him. It wasn't unusual for people to see someone carrying a bundle of sports gear or other items in the middle of a holiday, especially with the easy excuse of visiting family. What haunted the town of Cedar Glen later wasn't just what Patrick did, but how seamlessly he worked his way through the cracks of their community, planning every detail to perfection. Patrick had spent weeks rehearsing in his mind. When he reached the side of the Dunham house, he knew precisely where to breach. He had observed from afar the exact room where they gathered for meals and late-night chats. Peeking into the dining room window that evening, as the family sat laughing around their turkey dinner, Patrick's face remained cold, devoid of emotion. To him, this wasn't Thanksgiving, it was opening night for his twisted vendetta. Little did the Dunhams know, the carefully orchestrated tranquility of their picturesque suburban life was about to come crashing down. As Patrick loaded the AR-15 one final time, steadying his breath, the lines between perpetrator and victim blurred in his mind. What followed next would be remembered as one of Cedar Glen's darkest chapters, a horrifying testament to how calculated evil can silently brew unnoticed in the folds of ordinary American life. The first grave. Stealing a gun for revenge for Patrick Hensley, revenge wasn't an impulse, it was an obsession. Revenge had a rhythm, a timeline, and more importantly, a tool. The AR-15 rifle he painstakingly acquired wasn't simply for show or intimidation, it was a symbol of his power, his determination to turn the tables on those who looked down on him. But getting his hands on the weapon wasn't a clean affair. His criminal path didn't stop at shady online deals or distant target practice. No, Patrick needed more ammunition, and for that, he resorted to cold-blooded murder. On a brisk November night, a full week before the planned carnage, Patrick found himself on the outskirts of Cedar Glen, standing on the gravel path that led to a small independent security post. The building was old, a single-story shack with an aching roof, a relic of a time when the town relied on its own volunteers for safety patrols. It was manned by 2 local security officers, middle-aged men sitting behind a desk, likely chatting over stale coffee about how eerily quiet the roads had been during the Thanksgiving buildup. Patrick had already been here before, earlier in the month, when he scoped out their routine. He remembered the way one of the officers carelessly left the station's armory keys on the hook by the desk. Timing was everything. Cells of anger and fear surged through his veins as he steadied his breath. He knew the security station had one AR-15, kept in a wall-mounted safe for emergencies. Patrick wanted it. It had more firepower than the weapon he'd already procured online, and the sight alone of such a firearm would ensure compliance from his victims. He also wanted the ammunition knowing full well that it was locked up just feet away from the rifle. He imagined the precise weight of the loaded weapon, the cold steel in his hands. It was shortly after 11 p.m. when he approached the station. A faint orange glow from the single floodlight illuminated the dirt lot, giving the scene an almost haunting sense of intimacy. Patrick carried nothing but a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder, which concealed a pistol he didn't even intend to use unless it became absolutely necessary. His gray hoodie hung loosely over his frame, the hood pulled up and his face partially obscured. As he neared the station window, he could see the two officers inside. They weren't bored, they were joking with one another, their heads bobbing as they laughed over some shared story. For a split second Patrick hesitated, but only for a second. He took a sharp breath, pushed the door open, and walked in with the air of someone entirely at peace, as if he had a right to be there. "Evenin'," he said in a monotone voice. He didn't make eye contact. Cooler heads prevail. One of the officers glanced up, clearly puzzled but not alarmed. "Can I help you, son? We're not open to walk-ins unless you're here for something specific." Patrick took liberty with his next move. He gestured to his hoodie pocket as he approached the counter, though he didn't actually pull the pistol yet. I need help. Car broke down." His voice was tight and unconvincing, breathing rapid but somehow steady. The first thing that tipped the officers off wasn't his words. It was the deliberate way his hand hovered near his waist. It was too rehearsed, too unnatural. The second officer instantly tensed, his hand subtly moving toward the desk drawer where a small revolver was kept. He didn't have enough time. Patrick moved faster. From inside his hoodie emerged the pistol, now aimed directly at the two startled men. "Nobody move!" he barked, giving way to a panic-stricken but controlled tone. "Arms up, now!" The officers froze, startled by the incongruence between Patrick's wild-eyed expression and the steady hand gripping the gun. The irony was, Patrick wasn't sure if he'd pull the trigger, not yet. His plan had been to scare them into compliance, long enough to grab the armory keys. But adrenaline is a hateful thing. It twists even the best-laid plans into monstrous decisions. The first officer, thinking he saw an opening, lunged for the drawer. Crack. The sound wasn't deafening like in the movies, but sharp and thundering enough to command silence. Patrick's panic reflex squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the officer square in the chest, sending him tumbling backward into his chair. Blood bloomed across the front of his uniform like a merciless red rose. The second officer barely had time to react before Patrick turned the gun on him. Patrick shot to kill, 4 quick shots, all fired in stunning succession. The man crumpled forward, his hands clutching at his abdomen as crimson soaked through his shirt. It was over in less than 30 seconds. The room was suffocatingly quiet apart from Patrick's ragged breath and the faint wheeze of one officer clinging, fruitlessly, to life. For Patrick there was no step backward, no turning away from what he had become in those brief, violent moments. Instinct took over. He scanned the cramped station, his boots crunching against shards of coffee mugs shattered in the chaos. Blood pooled near the edge of the desk where one of the victims lay slumped, staring blankly at nothing. Patrick avoided the eyes, even as he greedily snatched the armory keys and made his way to the locked rifle safe hanging on the far wall. With trembling hands he inserted the key, the lock clicking open after what felt like hours. The AR-15 sat cradled inside, gleaming eerily under the pale fluorescent lights. Patrick reached for it like a man possessed, gripping it tightly, his movements now hurried and mechanical. He scavenged the compartment for ammunition, stuffing as much into his duffel bag as he could carry, his mind racing. Time was running out. Anyone could walk through that door at any second. As he stepped back into the cold night air, his heart beat furiously in his chest. He didn't allow himself to look back at what he'd done, at the haunting scene of carnage. The town's serene skyline glowed faintly in the distance as Patrick slipped into the shadows, his mind cycling through every possible way to justify his actions. It had to be done, he mumbled to himself under his breath, gripping the rifle tighter as he faded down the vacant street. By the time the two officers were discovered the next morning, it was too late. Patrick was already far from Cedar Glen, the AR-15 safely by his side as he thought of what to do next. Blood had been spilled, and it wasn't enough. Not yet. Not when there were still wrongs to be avenged. A chain of horror. With the AR-15 now in his possession and ammunition to last him several rampaging hours, Patrick Hensley became someone unrecognizable, a man propelled by rage, guided by resentment, and dictated by an unwavering urge for vengeance. The Cedar Glen massacre wasn't something that Patrick stumbled into carelessly. Rather, it was a deliberate, methodical act of terror that transformed a serene, festive suburb into the scene of an unspeakable tragedy. The evening of November 23rd began deceptively quiet. Families across Cedar Glen were immersed in their Thanksgiving routines, ritualistically preparing their turkeys, laying out fine china, and laughing over old family stories. At the Dunham house, the ultimate focus of Patrick's vendetta, the family gathered for their traditional feast. John Dunham, a stoic man in his early 50s, presided at the head of the table. His wife, Catherine, lovingly adjusted the table decoration, while their 3 children, Maggie, her 14-year-old brother Jason, and their 7-year-old sister Sophie, playfully bickered over who would carve the turkey. The idyllic scene inside was a stark contrast to what was brewing just outside their home. Patrick waited in the wooded area near the Dunham property, his chest tightening. The AR-15 hung from his shoulder, wrapped in the blanket that had concealed it from view as he made his way to the neighborhood. He could hear the muffled hum of laughter and clinking glasses through the glass windows, each sound rekindling the bitter humiliation he felt from the Dunhams rejecting him. They were living their perfect little lives while he had been cast out, forgotten, left to stew in his hatred. Patrick thought of everything he had done to reach this point, stealing the AR-15, practicing for precision, carefully timing his assault, and felt an overwhelming sense of control. For once, he believed he was the one with the power. At 8:24 p.m., Patrick made his move. He slowly approached the side of the Dunham house, his feet crunching lightly against the fallen leaves. The backyard was dimly lit, a single floodlight above the porch the only source of illumination. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance, but nothing about his presence seemed to disturb the pristine calm of the neighborhood. He reached the rear door, his cold breath visible in the crisp November air, and peered through the window pane. Inside, the family continued their holiday tradition. The youngest daughter, Sophie, was attempting to balance a slice of cornbread on her nose as her brother urged her to keep it steady. Patrick exhaled slowly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold. He felt the weight of the AR-15 in his hands. He had planned every moment up until now but never allowed himself to envision what came after he walked through that door. For Patrick, there was no after. He loaded his first magazine. The first shots ripped through the back door, splintering wood and shattering the warmth of the evening. The family froze, their faces contorted in confusion and fear. Patrick entered with the AR-15 pressed against his shoulder, his body rigid and his eyes aflame with fury. John Dunham was the first to act, instinctively pulling his youngest daughter behind him while shouting, "Who are you? What the hell's going on?" But Patrick didn't answer. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. The first shots hit John directly in the chest. The force of the impact sent him collapsing backward onto the dining table, shattering plates and glass as his children screamed in horror. Catherine rushed toward her husband in panic, only to be met by Patrick pivoting and firing again. The bullet hit her in the abdomen and she crumpled to the floor near her husband, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. Patrick's fury didn't spare anyone. He turned his attention to Maggie, a name that once made his heart race with love but now only fueled his thirst for retribution. Maggie's cries for mercy were acknowledged, with nothing but a cold, mechanical pull of the trigger. The gunfire echoed through the walls, silencing her. Jason, the 14-year-old, attempted to run for the front door. His small frame collided with the bookshelf as he tried to escape, but Patrick was faster. The shot hit Jason's back, and he fell face first onto the carpeted floor, his hands clawing forward in a desperate attempt to crawl away before another shot silenced him for good. 7-year-old Sophie, still cowering in the shadows of the dining room table, remained the last to face Patrick's wrath. For a brief second, Patrick hesitated, perhaps a fragment of guilt flickering in the cracked remnants of his humanity. But that moment passed quickly. He raised the rifle, squeezing the trigger mercilessly. No one would survive this night. The massacre inside the Dunham home didn't end with the family. Outside, a neighbor, a middle-aged man named Gregory Simmons, heard the gunshots and rushed over, panic etched across his face. As Gregory sprinted through the front yard, shouting for someone to call the police, Patrick stepped out from the front door. Gregory stopped abruptly, his breath hitching at the sight of Patrick's blood-smeared figure still gripping the AR-15. "What the hell are you doing?" Gregory yelled, his voice filled with both anger and fear. Patrick didn't even offer an explanation. In his mind, Gregory was collateral damage, someone who had the misfortune of crossing paths at the wrong time. One clean shot to the chest dropped the man where he stood. His body fell on the dewy grass of the front yard, steam rising gently from the pool of blood beneath him as the night grew colder. By the time the chaos settled, 6 members of the Dunham household and their unsuspecting neighbor lay lifeless. The once picturesque home that had radiated warmth and festive cheer was now unrecognizable, transformed into a blood-soaked tomb. Patrick glanced down at the carnage, his breathing heavy but methodical. He stepped over the shards of broken decorations and shattered glass, walking away into the crisp evening air. He had come not for material possessions or monetary gain. He had come to make a statement, one written in blood and grief that would haunt Cedar Glen forever. But Patrick wasn't done yet. He dragged Maggie's lifeless body out to his car, his only remaining connection to his past fixation on her. He positioned her in the passenger seat like a morbid symbol of his victory, though victory in this case left him feeling emptier than ever. Starting his engine, Patrick drove off into the inky blackness, just as the first sirens began to wail faintly in the distance. The massacre at the Dunham house sent shockwaves across Cedar Glen, leaving neighbors and authorities alike scrambling to comprehend the sheer brutality of the attack. 8 people were dead, 6 innocent family members and 2 random neighbors who had merely sought to help. Patrick's chain of horror left behind a trail of devastation that wouldn't end at the Dunham residence. It would take days for the town to uncover the full scale of what Patrick had unleashed, and weeks for the authorities to catch up. For Patrick, this massacre wasn't closure. It was only the beginning. The 6th victim appears. After the bloodbath inside the Dunham home, Patrick Hensley's warped sense of purpose drove him outside, into the cold Texan night. His ears still rang from the deafening bursts of gunfire, his fingers trembling slightly as they clumsily adjusted their grip on the AR-15. Behind him, the once pristine house, filled with Thanksgiving joy just moments before, now lay in eerie silence, its warmth extinguished by the chaos he had unleashed. The air smelled of spent gunpowder mingled with the faint sweetness of overturned cranberry sauce. As Patrick stepped onto the Dunham's front porch, the suburban serenity of Cedar Glen greeted him. Rows of houses sat quiet in the moonlight, their yards speckled with pumpkins and autumn wreaths hung carelessly on doors. It was late, most of the neighborhood either asleep or winding down their holiday festivities. For a second, Patrick imagined no one had heard the shots. Perhaps he could walk away, unseen, disappearing into the shadows like a ghost. But across the street, a porch light flickered on. Gregory Simmons, a man in his early 50s and a longtime neighbor of the Dunhams, emerged, squinting into the darkness. He hadn't been sleeping, he was nursing a warm beer and listening to the muffled post-game commentary of a football match when the distant crack of gunfire sliced through the quiet. At first, he thought it was fireworks, maybe some rowdy teenagers messing around early for New Year's. But the rhythmic staccato of the shots alerted him to something unusual. Loud for fireworks, Simmons muttered to himself, stepping out onto his porch, curiosity guiding his every move. Then he saw it, the faint, blood-streaked figure of Patrick stepping off the Dunham's front porch, the glossy black AR-15 prominent in his hands. At that moment, Simmons felt his stomach knot. His neighborly instincts overpowered the warning bells screaming in his brain. He jogged down his steps, concern etched across his face as he called out, "Everything all right there? Maggie? John?" Patrick froze mid-stride, his body tense and rigid as he turned toward Simmons, his expression eerily blank. The AR-15 gleamed in the dim light of the street lamps, beads of sweat catching the glow on his forehead. In that fleeting second, Patrick weighed his options. The adrenaline coursing through his veins screamed at him to act, to secure the moment he believed he had created. He had come too far, and in his warped logic, leaving witnesses behind threatened his narrative. "What's going on?" Simmons repeated, his voice louder now, laced with alarm. He started across the front lawn toward Patrick, trying to bridge the gap of confusion with logic. "Hey, put the rifle down, kid, let's just talk this through. Where's John?" Gregory's voice was steady, but the closer he drew, the more he noticed. The blood splattered across Patrick's hoodie, the cold, distant look in his eyes, and the dark fluid dripping from the barrel of the gun. The realization hit Simmons all at once. "Oh God," he breathed, now stepping back, his hands instinctively coming up in surrender. "What did you—" But Patrick didn't let him finish. With the same deadened resolve that filled the Dunham house with horror, Patrick raised the AR-15 and fired. The gunshot ripped through the night, the sound louder in the exposed air. The bullet struck Simmons square in the chest, knocking him clean off his feet. His body crumpled onto the dewy grass with a low, guttural exhale as his beer bottle clattered uselessly onto the pavement nearby. Simmons coughed, blood pooling around him as his hand weakly pressed against the wound. The shock in his eyes was still there, as if even in death he couldn't comprehend why this had happened, why his simple act of trying to help had turned into his last mistake. Patrick approached Gregory cautiously, his boots crunching on the freshly fallen leaves scattered across the lawn. He towered over the dying man, who could only manage an occasional sputter of breath. For a moment, Patrick paused, tilting his head as if to study Simmons. What did he think? That the man would serve as an example? A warning? Or maybe Patrick simply felt nothing at all. In his twisted mind, anyone who interfered, who represented the society that he blamed for his downfall, was fair game. He muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "You shouldn't have come outside." And with that, he stepped over Simmons' body, his boots leaving faint crimson imprints on the grass. Inside their well-kept homes, the surrounding neighbors remained oblivious. A few had heard something, a dull bang they dismissed as leftover firecrackers. None dared to peek past their curtains, their minds blissfully blank as they continued their evenings, unaware that their peaceful neighborhood was slowly becoming a graveyard. By the time Patrick reached his old sedan parked discreetly down the street, Simmons' body was already growing cold, dew from the lawn soaking into his clothes. The beer bottle he had dropped rolled faintly in the breeze, its contents mingling with the blood pooling on the grass. Simmons wasn't supposed to be part of the plan. This wasn't written into the script Patrick had churned over and over in his mind during sleepless nights of resentment. But plans evolve, Patrick thought as he tossed the rifle into the passenger seat beside him and started the engine. His breath steadied as his gaze hardened once more. Gregory Simmons was just another loose end to be tied up in the larger narrative of his vengeance. As he drove off into the night, the town remained largely silent, save for a barking dog in the distance. Little did anyone know that the terror had only just begun. The Dunhams weren't Patrick's only targets, and Simmons certainly wouldn't be the last to fall victim to his twisted rampage. Gregory Simmons, a good neighbor, a gentle soul, and a man who thought he could help, would later be remembered as the sixth victim. A tragic piece of collateral damage in an unthinkable chain of horror that Cedar Glen would struggle to fathom for years to come. A desperate escape. The bloody trail Patrick Hensley left behind him hadn't gone unnoticed, but in the immediate chaos of the massacre, he still had one thing on his side: time. Cedar Glen was not a place accustomed to deadly crimes. It was a sleepy, trusting town where community bonds ran deep, and violent acts belonged only to the headlines of faraway cities. By the time the first sirens broke the stillness of the night, Patrick was already on the move. His old, beaten-up sedan roared to life as he peeled away into the darkness, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had no destination, no long-term escape plan. What he did have, however, was a singular, terrifying determination to stay ahead of justice no matter the cost. Inside the car, the weight of his actions lingered in the silence. The AR-15 lay on the passenger seat, its barrel still warm, flecks of dried blood streaked along its surface. Patrick glanced at it briefly, his face expressionless. Next to the rifle, the lifeless body of Maggie Dunham sat slumped against the door window. Patrick had taken her from the Dunham house not out of sentimentality or remorse, but almost out of ritual. She had been the catalyst, the reason he had spiraled into this violent abyss. To him, her presence, or what was left of her, felt like some sinister trophy, a symbol of the vengeance he had exacted. The streets of Cedar Glen were eerily quiet as Patrick sped past familiar landmarks. The diner where he'd eaten pie just days before sat dark and empty. The small-town gas station, its neon light flickering intermittently, glowed faintly behind him as he accelerated down Main Street. In his rearview mirror the town seemed to shrink, swallowed by the shadows. But Patrick wasn't interested in looking back. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, a winding stretch of Texas highway shrouded in night. Patrick's first thought was survival. He knew that the police and the entire town would soon be hunting him. He couldn't stay in Texas. The borders of the state suddenly felt suffocatingly close, like walls closing in on him. His mind churned with vague ideas of crossing into another state, disappearing into the anonymity of larger cities or desolate rural areas. For now, his only goal was to cover as much ground as possible before anyone could connect the dots. As the hours passed, the adrenaline that had fueled Patrick's escape began to wear thin. His grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles pale against the leather. Bloodstains on his hoodie had dried into dark, crusted streaks, and sweat trickled down his temple as he fought the mounting exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but stopping at a diner or convenience store felt too risky. He imagined the clerk at the register recognizing his face, dialing 911 as soon as he turned his back. No, he couldn't risk it. Not yet. By dawn, Patrick had crossed 2 state lines, the jagged peaks of Arizona's desert stretching out on the horizon. He pulled over briefly along a dirt path, parking in the shadow of a rocky outcrop. The stillness of the desert felt oppressive, closing in on him as he stepped out of the car. The cold morning air bit at his skin, and for the first time he felt the sharp ache in his muscles, a brutal reminder of the frenzied violence from the night before. He walked a few paces into the desolate terrain, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. He glanced back at the car, at Maggie's body still propped in the passenger seat, her head limp against the glass. For a moment Patrick felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest, not regret, but something akin to nausea. It wasn't the blood or the death that unsettled him. It was the realization that this wasn't enough. He had thought vengeance would provide him with clarity, with closure. But standing there, staring into the vast emptiness of the desert, Patrick felt more lost than ever. The sound of a distant engine pulled him back to reality. A lone vehicle crept along the highway, a fleeting presence in the horizon's haze. Patrick turned sharply, his heart pounding, and jogged back to the car. Though he doubted anyone knew his exact location, the paranoia had already begun to set in. To him, anyone on the road was a threat. Slamming the car door shut, he started the engine again, kicking up a cloud of dust as he sped off. Over the next several days, Patrick drifted between back roads and unmarked trails, avoiding major highways and towns as much as possible. His reflection in the side view mirror grew more gaunt with each passing day. He scavenged supplies however he could, in one instance, sneaking into a closed gas station in the dead of night to steal bottled water and jerky. In another, he broke into an abandoned hunting cabin, snatching cans of food and prepackaged snacks left by whoever had once called the place home. Maggie's body began to decompose, the unbearable stench forcing Patrick to make a grim decision. Somewhere along the Nevada border, he pulled onto a desolate dirt trail, dragging her body out of the car. Under the cover of night, he buried what was left of her in a shallow grave, barely concealed by scattered rocks and loose dirt. He felt nothing as he covered her form with debris, his mind an empty void. She was gone now, but the hollow sense of rage remained, gnawing at his psyche like a relentless storm. The radio stations in his car crackled with news bulletins as he drove onward. Cedar Glen was now the epicenter of a nationwide manhunt, its usual quiet shattered by the arrival of federal agents and television crews. The words massacre, manhunt, and AR-15 armed killer reverberated through the airwaves, but Patrick tuned them out. They didn't matter, none of it mattered. All that existed for him was the endless stretch of road beneath his tires and the haunting specter of what he had done. Patrick's escape was not a streak of triumph. It was desperation written in long, sleepless nights and stolen moments of fleeting calm. Each passing town blurred into the next, an unremarkable parade of gas stations, motels, and barren highways. His world had shrunk to the confines of his car, where the stains of his crimes lingered like ghosts. Yet, through it all, he kept moving, convinced that if he could stay one step ahead of justice, his twisted narrative would remain intact. But even the longest roads eventually lead to dead ends. What Patrick didn't know, what he chose not to acknowledge, was that no escape can last forever. The storm he had created would catch up to him, and when it did, the echoes of Cedar Glen's tragedy would make sure he could never outrun the consequences. Law enforcement takes action, a game of cat and mouse. In the hours following the massacre at the Dunham household, Cedar Glen's sense of small-town safety evaporated. Police scanners buzzed with frantic calls, and patrol cars crisscrossed the quiet streets in search of any clue to Patrick Hensley's whereabouts. It was no longer a matter of investigating an isolated crime. This was a full-blown crisis. By dawn, the Cedar Glen Police Department had activated their regional counterparts, and by mid-morning, federal agents from the FBI had joined the effort. The hunt for Patrick Hensley, a mass murderer armed with an AR-15 and suspected of already crossing state lines, was about to become one of the most intense manhunts in the country's recent history. Still, law enforcement faced an uphill battle. Cedar Glen was not equipped to handle a case of this magnitude. The police department consisted of just a handful of officers who normally dealt with petty theft or the occasional domestic disturbance. Their crime scene investigators were overworked, trying to piece together the chaos Patrick had left behind in the Dunham home and the surrounding neighborhood. Blood-spattered walls, shattered furniture, and haunting silence told them a horrifying story, but the clues pointed to a single undeniable conclusion. Patrick wasn't done. Everything about the attack, from its methodical planning to the precision of the killings, suggested that he was on a rampage, not fleeing from consequences, but actively feeding his rage. The FBI quickly established a task force, its agents descending on Cedar Glen like an army moving into hostile territory. Roadblocks were set up on every highway leading out of Texas. Helicopters buzzed over the countryside as officers combed forested areas, unmarked trailers, and run-down motels in search of Patrick. Surveillance cameras at nearby gas stations and convenience stores were reviewed obsessively, looking for even a flicker of his beaten-up sedan. The manhunt was a well-oiled machine, and yet, Patrick managed to slip through every crack. It was as if he had disappeared entirely into the fabric of rural America, bending the back roads and abandoned trails to his will. The trail of chaos begins. It didn't take long for Patrick to leave breadcrumbs of his escape. Witnesses described seeing an unkempt young man matching his description wandering through a gas station in the outskirts of Tyler, Texas, just 2 days after the massacre. Security footage captured blurry images of him purchasing bottled water and canned food under the dim fluorescent lights, his hoodie pulled tightly over his face. Strangely, he appeared calm, almost indifferent, as he handed over crumpled bills to the cashier before disappearing into the night. The encounter sent shockwaves through the task force. If he was so brazen as to walk into public places, it meant one thing: he had no intention of stopping. From there, intermittent sightings began to trickle in, each one fueling the frantic chase. A family in Oklahoma reported seeing a car matching Patrick's sedan parked near their farmland, its driver sitting eerily still for hours before vanishing without a trace. 2 days later, a ranger in Arkansas stumbled upon a makeshift campsite deep in the woods, a pile of cigarette butts, ransacked food wrappers, and footprints leading back toward a nearby highway. Though the evidence was cold, it confirmed what the task force already feared. Patrick wasn't merely fleeing, he was laying low, recharging, and potentially planning his next moves. Patrick's ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement wasn't just luck, it was an unfortunate combination of tactical forethought, a familiarity with back roads, and an almost animalistic instinct for survival. Before the massacre, he had spent months researching rural routes, memorizing exits, and plotting hideouts. His resourcefulness made him unpredictable. One moment he relied on the urban camouflage of homeless shelters or crowded truck stops. The next, he disappeared into the most remote corners of the wilderness, places where no one would think to look for a fugitive. The authorities grew increasingly frustrated. Every lead seemed to end in a deadlock. Patrick's car, now considered his mobile fortress, had yet to be found. Tactical analyst reports indicated that he had likely stolen multiple unregistered license plates to swap out, making it harder to track him across state lines. Agents scoured pawn shops and black markets where he might procure additional weapons, but none of the sellers came forward with information. In some ways, Patrick's quiet, unremarkable demeanor proved to be his greatest weapon. Unlike criminals defined by chaos or recklessness, Patrick was methodical. He moved like a shadow through the cracks of society, leaving just enough of a trace to let them know he was still out there. The national spotlight turns to Cedar Glen. While the authorities became immersed in their game of cat and mouse, national media turned Cedar Glen into the center of its attention. News vans camped outside the police department, broadcasting scenes of distressed townspeople lighting candles at impromptu memorials for the victims. Dove-shaped wreaths lined the sidewalks of the Dunham residence, now cordoned off by bright yellow crime scene tape. Families, still shaken from the massacre, locked their doors and drew their curtains, terrified that Patrick might return to finish what he started. The coverage exploded further when the FBI officially labeled Patrick a domestic terrorist. Headlines blared dramatic words like "Cedar Glen Massacre," accompanied by pictures of Patrick's wide, sunken eyes, his mugshot becoming the face of fear across America. Internet forums buzzed with amateur trackers and armchair detectives uploading theories about his next move. Some speculated that he had already crossed into Mexico or vanished into Canada. Others believed he was hiding in plain sight, protected by sympathizers who shared his growing hatred for the family he saw as enemies. Collaboration across borders. The pressure mounted as the weeks stretched on with little indication of Patrick's capture. Border Patrol agents stationed near Mexico received heightened orders. stopping and inspecting every vehicle that fit even the loosest description of his sedan. Interpol was even brought into the fold in case Patrick had managed to slip overseas. A countrywide alert system issued via amber and silver alerts informed citizens to immediately report any sign of his car or physical description. However, Patrick proved to be a master of slipping through the system's gaps. In Kansas, 5 cars were checked based on witness tips, none related to him. In Tennessee, someone mistook a drifter's campsite for his hideout, costing authorities hours of wasted time. Patrick's ability to remain elusive became more than a tactical feat. It became a psychological game of control. For every false lead or dead end, he continued to dictate the tempo of the chase, forcing agents to react to nothing while he moved somewhere new, an escalating desperation asterisk. But Patrick underestimated one thing: the relentless grind of the law. Law enforcement doesn't sleep. As resilient as Patrick believed himself to be, the task force would not falter in its hunt. Investigators methodically unraveled every breadcrumb he left behind, from his amateur campsite in Arkansas to abandoned water bottles outside an unoccupied cabin in Missouri, and they were getting closer. While Patrick's escape felt like a triumph for himself, his decisions reflected growing exhaustion and desperation. As systems of law and human networks continued closing in, cracks began to appear. The cat no longer merely chased the mouse began running in circles. What Patrick didn't know was that Cedar Glen's darkness had reached beyond town. Federal agents and small-town officers shared the same grim conviction: his time was running out. Eventually the string of luck would end, and when it did, every misstep would trap him tighter in their growing net. The cat would catch the mouse, leaving him with no more roads to flee and nowhere left to hide. Scattered traces. As the days turned into weeks, the manhunt for Patrick Hensley stretched across state lines, morphing into a chaotic pursuit filled with fleeting sightings and frustrating dead ends. Each day brought with it new reports, glimpses of a man who might be Patrick, and a parade of clues that felt more like ghosts, there one moment, gone the next. The task force tracking him was relentless, but Patrick had mastered the art of vanishing, leaving only faint traces behind like breadcrumbs scattered across the American landscape. The trail was rarely straightforward. Patrick was not an amateur when it came to staying hidden. Every move he made was calculated to ensure he left just enough evidence to keep moving, but never too much to be caught. His ability to navigate rural America became both a source of pride for him and torment for the FBI. A rancher in northern Oklahoma spotted a suspicious figure scrounging around his barn late one night. By the time law enforcement arrived, all they found was a half-eaten tin of beans and faint footprints leading toward a sprawling wheat field. The rancher described the mysterious man as thin, young, wearing a dirty sweatshirt, but that description could have fit hundreds of drifters in the region. 2 days later, a gas station attendant near Little Rock, Arkansas, reported an unsettling encounter. A beat-up sedan rolled into the station just before midnight, its headlights dim, the driver sitting motionless for nearly 5 minutes before stepping out. The man, dressed in tattered clothing soaked with sweat, kept his hood low and his head down. Surveillance footage showed him nervously scanning the aisles, grabbing water bottles, beef jerky, and a pack of cigarettes before paying in cash. When asked by the attendant if he was doing all right, the man mumbled something incomprehensible before rushing back to his car. His vehicle disappeared into the Arkansas backroads as quietly as it had arrived. The footage didn't offer a clear look at his face, but agents believed it was Patrick. The quiet desperation in his demeanor matched the profile of a fugitive slowly unraveling but determined to survive. Patrick's next move brought him deeper into the wilderness. A park ranger in the Ozarks stumbled upon a makeshift campsite hidden behind a dense cluster of trees. The site was crude, nothing more than a discarded sleeping bag, empty water bottles, and a campfire that had recently burned out. Nearby there were cigarette butts scattered across the dirt, a brand that matched the pack bought at the gas station just days earlier. The ranger noted the eerie calm of the scene, describing it as the kind of place someone stays when they don't want to be found. But again, Patrick was already gone, moving further into the forest long before authorities could close in on him. It wasn't just isolated campsites and gas station sightings that left investigators chasing shadows. Patrick's car, a critical piece of evidence in his escape, became a phantom in its own right. Witnesses across multiple states reported seeing a battered sedan on rural highways and quiet country roads, yet every time law enforcement caught up to the lead, they found nothing. One trucker claimed to have seen the car parked on the side of a highway near the Texas-Oklahoma border. its driver sitting eerily still behind the wheel as dusk settled across the horizon. The trucker didn't stop, only realizing later when pictures of Patrick's car surfaced in the news that it might have been him. By the time officers checked the area, there was no sign of the sedan. Whether Patrick had been there or not, he had vanished into the night. What baffled investigators wasn't just Patrick's ability to slip away, but the psychology behind his movements. His trail wasn't as chaotic or desperate as one might expect from a fugitive on the run after such a horrific massacre. There seemed to be a pattern to his methods, a deliberate, almost methodical approach to keeping himself one step ahead of the law. He had a way of blending in, using the anonymity of late-night truck stops, deserted campgrounds, and back roads to disappear. Occasionally he even appeared to toy with the authorities, leaving behind subtle signs of his presence. Discarded items, cigarette ashes, even scratched-out license plates he had swapped from abandoned cars, almost as if to remind them he was still out there. One particularly haunting discovery came from the owner of a hunting cabin deep in the forests of Missouri. When the man returned to his property after a week's absence, he noticed that someone had been there. His cabinets, once stocked with canned food and bottled water, had been raided. A few muddy boot prints trailed from the back door to the kitchen. On the floor near the fireplace, the owner found the remnants of a torn map, one corner of it showing the outline of a major highway system. Authorities believed this was Patrick's work. The map suggested he was planning his next move, carefully charting routes that allowed him to bypass highways with routine police patrols. The boot prints led out the back door and disappeared into the dense underbrush, leaving yet another unresolved chapter in the search for Cedar Glen's most wanted man. Fueling the frustration of the task force was Patrick's apparent resourcefulness. Despite his limited funds and lack of connections, he managed to survive week after week, evading the best efforts of local, state, and federal law enforcement. He scavenged for food, stole only what he absolutely needed, and avoided any unnecessary risks. Psychologists brought in to analyze his behavior suggested that Patrick was operating in a state of hyper-focused survival, driven by the same cold, methodical mindset that had allowed him to orchestrate the massacre in Cedar Glen. He wasn't running blindly, he was adapting to his situation, constantly staying just far enough ahead to remain free. The scattered traces weren't just physical. Patrick also left behind emotional and psychological scars on everyone who encountered him, whether directly or indirectly. Everyone who saw his face, even for a fleeting moment, reported feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, like they were in the presence of someone who had nothing left to lose. His actions had turned ordinary locations, gas stations, campgrounds, quiet highways, into places of fear, every shadow, every unexplained movement carrying the possibility that Patrick Hensley was hiding somewhere nearby, but these scattered traces were slowly building a clearer picture for the task force. With every empty campfire, every restless night in America's small towns and rural stretches, Patrick's resources were thinning. His trails were becoming sloppier, his movements more predictable to the trained eyes searching for him. Though Patrick seemed like a ghost, capable of disappearing at will, the captured shards of evidence, no matter how small, were beginning to form the outline of his next steps. The cat-and-mouse game was far from over, but the cracks in Patrick's evasive maneuvers were slowly beginning to show. For now, Patrick remained at large, continuing to haunt the back roads of America, his mind a constant storm of paranoia and purpose. But each faint footprint, every discarded bottle or cigarette butt, was tightening the net around him. Somewhere out there, surrounded by the wilderness and the dark highways that stretched endlessly in every direction, Patrick Hensley kept moving, unaware that the threads of his freedom were starting to fray. The hostage, forced captive, or willing accomplice? As Patrick Hensley's violent spree tightened its grip on the national conscience, a piece of the puzzle emerged that left law enforcement, the media, and the public deeply divided: the mysterious young woman accompanying him. Descriptions of her began to trickle in during the earliest sightings of his escape. Witnesses noted her presence in the passenger seat of Patrick's vehicle, an ashen-faced, silent figure with her hair disheveled and eyes downcast, seemingly unwilling, yet never making any visible attempt to flee. The question that haunted investigators was clear: who was she? More importantly, what role did she play in Patrick's string of horrors? Was she merely a hostage, trapped in Patrick's nightmarish game of violence and concealment? Or could she be something far more chilling, a willing participant, bound to him not by force, but by shared intent? The first glimpses. The young woman first surfaced in the chaotic moments following Patrick's escape. Witnesses at a filling station in rural Oklahoma described a pale, anxious-looking girl sitting rigidly in the passenger seat of Patrick's battered sedan. "She didn't say a word," recalled an elderly man pumping gas at the station that evening. "She just stared straight ahead like she wasn't there, like she didn't want to be noticed." The man later told law enforcement that she didn't seem to wave or signal for help, though he could sense something was off. "It was the look in her eyes," he said, "like she was scared out of her mind." A trucker from Arkansas gave a similar account after seeing Patrick's car at a roadside diner. "She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. But here's the thing, she wasn't crying or yelling, she just went along with whatever he was doing." According to the trucker, Patrick ordered food and returned to the car while the girl sat still, clutching something tightly in her lap. At the time of these sightings, most believed the young woman to be an unfortunate victim snatched up in Patrick's wake of destruction. The image painted was of a girl too terrified to resist, held captive by a man who had demonstrated shocking levels of violence. But as more details emerged, doubts began to creep into investigators' minds. Passive victim or calculating helper? By the second week of Patrick's escape, law enforcement began piecing together a grim timeline of his movements. Surveillance footage, eyewitness reports, and tracks left behind at crime scenes confirmed the young woman was present at nearly every step of his journey. One particular incident stirred suspicion: a break-in at a rural hunting cabin in Missouri. Authorities found clear signs of two people, two sets of footprints, two empty dishes on the table, and a shared sleeping arrangement in the cabin's only bed. The girls' participation became even murkier when they reviewed surveillance footage from a convenience store near Little Rock, Arkansas. The video captured Patrick and the young woman entering the store together. In the footage, Patrick calmly retrieved a few items off the shelf while the girl hung back by the entrance, scanning the store's interior and the parking lot outside. To investigators, her behavior looked less like someone searching for a chance to escape, and more like someone keeping watch. Was she complicit in Patrick's plans, aiding him in his carefully calculated escape and survival? Law enforcement wasn't so sure. They had seen enough cases of Stockholm Syndrome to know that prolonged exposure to a captor could twist a victim's mind into feelings of dependence or loyalty. But they also couldn't ignore evidence suggesting that the girl might have, at some point, crossed the line from hostage to accomplice. Who was she? Desperately seeking answers, investigators dug into every possible lead to unravel the girl's identity. Initial rumors speculated she might be someone Patrick had coerced or abducted along his escape route. Them searching through missing persons reports near Patrick's known locations yielded no promising results. It wasn't until a local journalist uncovered an old school yearbook photograph that the truth came crashing down. The young woman wasn't some random abducted stranger, she was Julia Crowley, Patrick's estranged high school girlfriend. Disbelief rippled across law enforcement as the realization struck. This wasn't a case of a random hostage situation. This was personal. Their history together, interviews with Julia's friends, family, and former classmates revealed a tumultuous relationship that had ended years earlier, but not cleanly. In high school, Patrick and Julia had been inseparable, united by their shared feelings of alienation from Cedar Glen's more privileged social circles. She made him feel like he belonged, one of Julia's old friends recounted. But things started to go downhill fast. He was possessive, controlling. The pair reportedly had a dramatic falling out during their senior year, shortly before Julia distanced herself from Cedar Glen entirely. She had moved to northern Texas, finding work waiting tables at a diner. She hadn't been heard from in years, and to those who knew her it was surprising to see her name tied so closely to Patrick's horrifying crimes. But why had Julia returned to Patrick's side? Had her involvement begun under duress, a victim of Patrick's fury, or was there a sliver of rekindled connection that let him manipulate her back into his orbit? Theories take shape. Investigators floated several theories to explain Julia's presence in Patrick's vehicle. Some believed her appearance was purely circumstantial. Patrick may have forcibly abducted her after tracking her down, an act consistent with his obsessive tendencies. Others, however, pointed to the evidence suggesting a more cooperative relationship. Could Julia have seen Patrick as a kindred spirit once again, someone battling the same demons that had plagued her? Had Patrick exploited her familiarity with him, coaxing her into compliance before she realized the gravity of his plans? More troubling, was it possible that Julia's involvement wasn't coerced at all? Acts of silence. The most haunting aspect of Julia's presence throughout Patrick's manhunt was her silence. Witnesses consistently described her as withdrawn and uncommunicative, rarely making eye contact and never calling for help. Whether at a gas station or huddling in Patrick's shadow at campsites, she remained an enigma, telling no one her story yet giving no clear signals of distress. Her silence was impossible to interpret. Had Patrick threatened her into submission? Or had she chosen her silence willingly, bound to him by fear, love, or even delusions of loyalty? The need for answers. Julia's role raised more questions than it answered. As the authorities tightened the net around Patrick, they also prepared for the possibility that the girl by his side could be just as important in unraveling the case as he was. They hoped that, when the time came, Julia might provide the answers they desperately needed to understand her entanglement with Patrick's violence. Was she a girl who had been swept into a nightmare she couldn't escape, or a partner in Patrick's crimes, sharing his wrath in ways they couldn't yet fathom? The stakes rose with every day she stayed by his side, leaving the country debating the most crucial question, victim or accomplice. The man and the AR-15 captured. The capture of Patrick Hensley came as a surprise but not a shock to law enforcement. After weeks of relentless searching marked by dead-end leads and fleeting sightings, the walls around Patrick finally closed in on a cold morning in December. His days of running were over, the threat he posed extinguished by the unwavering persistence of those determined to bring him to justice. The events of his arrest would later be recounted as both an exercise in tactical brilliance and a testament to sheer patience, leaving no room for mistake. It was in the early hours of December 18th, 3:37 a.m. to be exact, when Patrick's luck ran out. For weeks, law enforcement had been tracking his movements, slowly piecing together a map of his likely whereabouts. He had grown predictable, not in his broader strategy of evasion but in the details. Patrick's methodical nature, which had helped him evade police for so long, turned against him. He circled back to the same types of places, a pattern the FBI behavioral unit used to predict his next steps. It was this, coupled with the vigilance of small-town motel workers, that brought the nightmare to an end. The motel sightings Patrick appeared at the Maplewood Inn, a grimy roadside motel on the outskirts of Kansas City, late on December 17th. The innkeeper, a wiry man with a mop of graying hair, remembered him vividly. Patrick's face was drawn, his clothes torn and stained with dirt, his demeanor jittery but composed enough to avoid drawing immediate suspicion. Carrying a duffel bag over his shoulder, Patrick requested a room farthest from the office and as private as possible. It wasn't unusual for travelers to ask for such a room, but the undercurrent of tension in the young man's clipped sentences didn't sit well with the innkeeper. Later, a cleaning lady passing by the window of Patrick's room spotted the unmistakable AR-15 rifle partially visible against the bedspread. Her heart sank. "You don't see something like that and brush it off," she said in a later interview. "I just knew something was wrong." Though she didn't dare confront him, her instincts told her to report it. By the time she returned to the motel office and relayed her observation, the innkeeper was already dialing 911. The tactical decision. Within 30 minutes, law enforcement had descended on the Maplewood Inn. Officers from Kansas City's SWAT team, as well as federal agents, quietly secured the perimeter of the property, setting up roadblocks for miles around. The leadership team debated their next move. Patrick's reputation preceded him. He was armed, volatile, and had already proven he wouldn't hesitate to escalate to lethal violence. They had no way of knowing how much ammunition he still carried or whether he had booby-trapped the room. A full-on assault could lead to catastrophic casualties, not only for law enforcement but for Patrick's alleged hostage, Julia Crowley, whose presence had been confirmed by additional witness reports. Instead, authorities opted for a more calculated approach. They established surveillance on the room, waiting for Patrick to reveal his next move. Hours ticked by, and tension ran high. Every crackle of a walkie-talkie, every shifting shadow in the winter night carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The standoff begins. At dawn's first light, around 6:15 a.m., Patrick stepped out of his room for the first time. Clad in the same tattered hoodie he'd worn for weeks, he didn't appear to notice the SWAT officers hidden in the surrounding foliage. He was carrying the AR-15, but it wasn't raised. It hung loosely at his side. Julia, pale and trembling, followed close behind, though she made no effort to flee or cry out for help. A loudspeaker crackled to life, breaking the stillness of the morning. "Patrick Hensley, this is the Kansas City Police Department. Put down your weapon and surrender immediately. You are surrounded and have no way out." Patrick froze for a split second. His eyes darted toward the line of trees where the voice had come from. He raised the AR-15, slowly at first but not high enough to take aim. The tension was electric. Were his actions a sign of surrender or defiance? "Put the gun down," the voice repeated, louder this time. For a moment it seemed like Patrick might comply. His grip on the rifle loosened slightly, and he exhaled audibly, his shoulders slumping. But then his eyes hardened, his jaw clenched, and he hoisted the AR-15 to his shoulder. Whatever fleeting thoughts of surrender had crossed his mind disappeared in an instant, replaced by the overwhelming fury that had driven him since the night of the massacre. The final moments law enforcement acted immediately. A sniper stationed on a nearby rooftop fired a single shot. The bullet struck Patrick in the shoulder, causing him to stagger backward but not drop the gun entirely. Before he could recover, SWAT officers closed the gap, storming his position in a coordinated blitz. Patrick's face contorted with rage as officers wrestled him to the ground. His hands futilely clutched the rifle before it was wrenched free and tossed aside. "You think this is over?" Patrick snarled as cuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. "You'll never understand why I did it. None of you do." Julia, meanwhile, collapsed to the pavement, her body shaking with sobs. An officer approached her cautiously, placing a hand on her shoulder and asking if she was injured. She shook her head but said nothing, staring blankly at the ground as they guided her away from Patrick. Inside the room, when officers swept Patrick's motel room, they found further disturbing evidence of his growing instability. Spread out across the small desk were handwritten notes, rambling and disjointed, detailing his warped justifications for the massacre. Maps marked with red ink pointed to potential future targets, suggesting that Patrick had planned to continue his reign of terror. Perhaps most unsettling was the state of Julia's belongings, torn clothes hastily stuffed into a corner indicating her struggle, alongside a notebook filled with cryptic messages. Some appeared to be pleas for help, while others hinted at a complex psychological dependency on Patrick. Investigators immediately recognized the fragile mental state she must have been in, though it would take months of interviews and therapy to fully understand her role in his escape. The aftermath. Patrick Hensley's arrest marked the end of a tense and frightening chapter for the country. News of his capture dominated headlines, and footage of his bloodied face, festering with hatred and defeat, was broadcast nationwide. Cedar Glen began the slow process of recovery, though the trauma of what Patrick had unleashed remained palpable. Julia Crowley's fate became another focal point of public discourse. Was she a broken victim of Patrick's manipulation? Or had she, at some point, crossed into complicity? Investigators sought to unravel the truth as psychologists conducted interviews to gauge whether she had acted out of survival or shared belief in Patrick's twisted ideology. As for Patrick, the man who had terrorized Cedar Glen and beyond, he would face trial for his heinous crimes. Yet his arrest, violent and chaotic as it was, offered some semblance of closure to a community that had been gripped by terror for weeks. The man and his AR-15 were finally cornered, and no hollow words of defiance could erase the consequences of his actions. For Patrick Hensley, the road had ended. Justice was now inevitable. The interrogation, unmasking the killer. After Patrick Hensley's dramatic capture, the nation, the victims' families, and the investigators were left with one pressing demand: answers. People wanted to know what drove an unremarkable young man to commit one of the most heinous massacres in recent memory. The days following his arrest turned into a psychological chess game as Patrick was interrogated by seasoned FBI investigators. Every word, every flicker of emotion, every moment of silence became a window into his fractured psyche as law enforcement sought to decipher whether Patrick was a cold-blooded monster or a man whose rage and resentment had consumed him entirely. Patrick Hensley walked into his first interrogation with an air of eerie calm. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, his face still bruised from the takedown, his sunken eyes darted around the dull interrogation room. The FBI agents assigned to his case watched closely, studying the slight twitch of his jaw, the sharp inhales through his nose. Patrick wasn't some volatile, unhinged killer frothing at the mouth. He was calculated, his silence heavy with an unspoken arrogance. He knew they wanted his story, and he wasn't going to give it away for free. The opening moves agent Maria Carter and her partner agent Derek Langston led the session. Carter, a veteran profiler, took the lead with calm authority. "Patrick," she began, her voice measured, almost soothing, "you know why you're here, you know what you did. These families, this town, they're grieving, confused. If there's anything human left in you, now's the time to explain yourself." Patrick leaned back in his chair, the chains on his wrists clinking softly. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he said nothing. His dark, hollow eyes scanned Carter like a predator sizing up its prey. Langston leaned forward, his tone sharper. 8 people are dead, Patrick. 8. You've stolen lives, shattered families. The least you can do is tell us why. Patrick tilted his head slightly, his lips parting as if he were about to speak. Instead he laughed, a low, humorless sound that echoed in the small, sterile room. Why? He repeated, his voice a rasp. You think you'd understand? People like you never do. You've never been on the outside looking in. You've never had everything you wanted ripped away because someone decided you weren't worth it. His words dripped with bitterness, and for the first time, a glimmer of raw emotion cracked through his cold exterior. Carter seized the opportunity. You're talking about the Dunhams, aren't you? She pressed gently. Their rejection, Maggie turning away from you, it felt like a betrayal. Is that it, Patrick? Is that what fueled all this? Patrick's jaw tightened, and his knuckles whitened as his fingers curled into fists. He leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. Betrayal doesn't even begin to cover it. Maggie, she made promises. She wanted me. And they, her family, they poisoned her against me. Made me out to be some loser, some failure. They took everything from me. The core of his rage. Over the course of hours, Patrick's narrative began spilling out in fragments, pieces of a dark and fractured worldview that painted him more as a man consumed by his own bitterness than a simple monster. To Patrick, the Dunhams had not just rejected him, they had stripped him of his dignity. By ending his relationship with Maggie under pressure from her parents, Patrick felt he had lost the only anchor that had kept his unstable world together. And their rejection, in his eyes, wasn't just personal, it was societal. You think they were the first to look down on me? Patrick spat, his voice crackling with rage as he stared daggers at the agents. They weren't. They were just another pillar of this world that chews you up and spits you out if you don't fit their mold. Good family? Good job? That's all they cared about. Not Maggie's happiness, not mine. They wanted me gone because I didn't measure up to their perfect little picture. Langston folded his arms, his eyes narrowing. So what? Killing them was your way of leveling the playing field? You thought that murdering an entire family, including a 7-year-old girl, would somehow give you back your dignity? Patrick blinked, his face momentarily faltering. For a second, Langston's words seemed to penetrate the wall of his resolve. But then, Patrick's lips pressed into a thin, defiant line. You wouldn't understand, he muttered. It had to be done. They were the disease, not me. All of them, every one of them, was part of the same machine that tries to keep you small. Shocking admissions. As the interrogation continued, Patrick's confessions grew darker and more revealing. He admitted to meticulously planning the massacre for months, from the illegal acquisition of the AR-15 to the surveillance of the Dunham family's daily routines. He described the stolen firearm and the break-in at the security post as necessary steps, and expressed no remorse for the 2 guards he had murdered to obtain the weapon. When asked about the youngest victim, 7-year-old Sophie Dunham, Patrick's mask of indifference cracked slightly. I didn't want to kill her, he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. I didn't plan for that, but she was there. You don't understand. It wasn't about her. It was about them. Carter pushed further, her voice hardened. And Julia, what about her? Did you force her to come with you, or did she join willingly? Patrick's brow furrowed, and for the first time, he looked unsettled. Julia, he murmured, trailing off. She understood what it was like to be out there, alone, cast aside. That's why I found her. She got it. She got me. Langston pressed on. Did she get you, or did you take her? Did she have any choice in following you after the massacre? Patrick's jaw clenched, his eyes darting away. A tense silence filled the room, heavy with implication. Patrick didn't give a direct answer, but his lack of denial spoke volumes. The unapologetic truth. By the end of the interrogation, one thing had become glaringly clear. Patrick Hensley was no ordinary killer. His actions weren't driven by random chaos or uncontrolled fury, but by a deeply rooted hatred for a world he believed had wronged him. In his mind, the murders were not just an outlet for his rage but a symbolic rebellion against a system he thought was rigged. I could have stopped at them, Patrick said, his voice distant as he stared at the metal table in front of him. I could have stopped with the Dunhams, but they're just one family, one representation of everything wrong with this world. The disease is everywhere. I was just... He paused, his lips twitching into a faint, almost sinister smile. I was just doing what nobody else has the guts to do. A glimpse into the abyss. Patrick's confessions, disjointed and chilling, painted a portrait of a man who neither sought redemption nor acknowledged the humanity of his victims. To him, they were symbols, tools in his quest for some warped form of justice. The weight of his words lingered long after he was escorted back to his cell, leaving the agents and investigators with a haunting realization. Patrick Hensley was capable of justifying anything under the banner of his twisted logic. Though the interrogation provided answers, it also raised troubling questions. Would Patrick show regret as his trial approached, or would he cling to the narrative of a man fighting against a perceived enemy? What role did Julia play in his escape and evasion? The answers were nothing short of horrifying, unmasking him as both a methodical planner and a man consumed entirely by his vendettas. Under the light of justice. At last, justice caught up with Patrick Hensley. His capture marked the end of a blood-soaked odyssey of terror that left Cedar Glen forever changed. But for the families of the victims, the community haunted by his crimes, and a nation captivated by his rampage, the question lingered: what would justice look like? The following months were a painstaking journey through the legal system, a fight between a society desperate for closure and a man who still refused to show an ounce of remorse. Patrick Hensley's trial became one of the most high-profile criminal proceedings in recent memory, covered relentlessly by the media, and debated fiercely across dinner tables, newsrooms, and courtrooms alike. It wasn't just about punishing a man for his brutal crimes, it was about understanding the magnitude of his darkness, about confronting the systems and failures that allowed someone like him to exist, undetected and unchallenged until it was too late. The courtroom drama begins. The trial officially began in a packed courtroom on a crisp spring morning. Families of the victims filled the gallery, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes brimming with quiet determination to see justice served. Reporters jostled outside the courthouse, eager to capture every moment, every word, every tear that would unfold within the courtroom's solemn walls. The world was watching. Patrick Hensley, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, was escorted into the room, shackled and flanked by armed guards. His face was unreadable, a mask of cold detachment. Gone was the wild-eyed fugitive who had terrorized multiple states. In his place sat a man who exuded an eerie calmness, as though the trial itself was just another spectacle to endure, one more chapter of a story he had already written in his mind. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Colleen Myers, opened the trial with words that hung in the air like a solemn vow. This case is not just about numbers. It's not just about 8 victims. It's about a community torn apart. It's about families who will never again hear the laughter of their loved ones, who will forever wonder why someone could commit such unspeakable acts. Myers laid out the case with surgical precision. The premeditation, the AR-15 acquisition, the slaughter at the Dunham house, the cold-blooded killing of Gregory Simmons, the calculated escape, and the chilling evidence recovered from his motel room. She painted Patrick as a man who didn't snap in a moment of rage but who had spent months meticulously plotting an act of hate-fueled vengeance. This was not survival, she told the jury. This was annihilation, planned down to the last bullet. Patrick's defense, a hollow argument. Patrick's defense team faced an uphill battle from the start. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly against him, and the mountain of evidence, including his chilling interrogation confessions, left little room for doubt. During opening statements, Patrick's defense attorney, Mitchell Ross, attempted to redirect the narrative. He didn't deny Patrick's actions but argued that they stemmed from profound mental illness. "Mr. Hensley is not a monster," Ross told the jury. "He is a deeply broken man whose tortured psyche drove him to do the unthinkable. This case is a tragedy, and his actions, while horrific, are the result of a man who fell through every crack in the system meant to protect people like him, and people like the victims." The defense introduced testimony from psychologists and social workers who had analyzed Patrick's mental state. They spoke of his childhood filled with neglect, his lack of a support system, and his years of isolation that likely exacerbated feelings of paranoia and resentment. But as compelling as these narratives were, they could not overshadow the cold reality of Patrick's deeds. The prosecution demolished the defense's argument, reminding the jury that while Patrick had survived a difficult life, it did not absolve him of the deliberate, calculated brutality of his actions. The testimonies. In the weeks that followed, the courtroom became a crucible of raw emotion. Family members of the victims took the stand, their voices trembling with grief but steady with purpose. Maggie Dunham's mother Catherine, who had barely survived the massacre, relived the night she had witnessed her family's destruction. Holding a tissue in one hand and a photograph of her children in the other, she recounted the horrific moments when Patrick stormed into their home. "He didn't just take lives, he took futures, dreams, and years of love we'll never get back," she said, her voice breaking. Gregory Simmons's widow also testified, describing how her husband, a man who never hesitated to help his neighbors, became one of Patrick's victims simply because he had rushed out to help during the chaos. "Patrick Hensley didn't just kill my husband," she said through tears. "He left a hole in this community that will never fully heal." The most gut-wrenching testimony perhaps came from Julia Crowley. Seen by many as a second victim of Patrick's manipulation, her presence in the trial brought as many questions as answers. Taking the stand, she spoke in a halting voice about the complex and abusive dynamic between her and Patrick, admitting to being both terrified of him and, at times, inexplicably loyal. "There were moments when I thought I could escape," Julia told the court, avoiding Patrick's cold gaze from across the room, "but he always knew how to pull me back in. It was like I forgot who I was without him and yet hated who I was with him." Julia's testimony cemented Patrick's narrative as that of a predator, not just of the Dunhams, but of anyone within his gravitational pull. The verdict. After nearly 3 months of intense arguments, tearful testimonies, and chilling evidence, the trial reached its conclusion. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before delivering its unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts, including 8 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and illegal weapons possession. The room held its breath as the judge read the decision. The sentencing phase was no less dramatic. The prosecution pushed for the harshest penalty allowed by law, the death sentence. Anything less would be an insult to the lives he stole, District Attorney Myers argued. The defense, meanwhile, pleaded for life imprisonment without parole, arguing that Patrick's death would do nothing to repair the damage caused. In the end, the judge sided with the prosecution. Patrick Hensley was sentenced to death, his crimes deemed so heinous and calculated that only the ultimate punishment could fit. As the sentence was read, Patrick remained expressionless, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance, as if he were already detached from the facade of accountability. Cedar Glen's long road to healing. With Patrick's trial now closed, Cedar Glen slowly began the arduous process of healing. Memorials were held in honor of the lives lost, and the community rallied around the survivors and families in ways that illustrated their resilience. Local leaders initiated programs to address mental health, conflict resolution, and community safety, hoping to ensure that such a tragedy would never be repeated. Yet the scars remained. For many, Patrick's sentencing marked closure, but not peace. The families of the victims carried their grief like an unshakable shadow, while a generation of Cedar Glen residents would grow up haunted by the memory of what had happened. A sobering legacy. Patrick Hensley's story wasn't just one of violence, it was a chilling reminder of how desperation and unchecked rage, when left unchallenged, could turn into something monstrous. Across the country, activists and lawmakers debated the broader implications of Patrick's actions, from gun control to mental health interventions to the warning signs overlooked in lives like his. Justice, in the end, was served. Patrick Hensley, man and murderer, would pay the steepest price for his crimes. But the tale of Cedar Glen wasn't a simple one of villains and victims. It was a reflection of a society grappling with its darkest truths, learning painfully that justice can't resurrect the dead, but it can shine a light on what must be changed.